Okay, let's get started. So it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Matheus Hostert as the seminar speaker today. He received his PhD degree in 2019, right? From Durham University, and since then, and then after he joined University of Minnesota and the Perimeter Institute as a postdoc. He's an expert on BSM phenomenology and neutrino physics. So today, he's going to talk about MiniBooNE access and the MicroBooNE, the recent MicroBooNE, the result. So please.
Yeah, thank you, Dijin. Thank you for a very nice invitation. It is great to be in Texas for the first time. So very nice campus that you have here. The plan for today is to discuss a little bit about new physics explanations of the MiniBooNE access, and then try to interpret them given the latest results of the MicroBooNE experiment. So these are some of the people that I've worked with. So the main part of this talk will be with a paper with all of these people here from Fermilab, Harvard, and CERN. And towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about dark sectors, which is work in collaboration with these people at the bottom here. So we'll review the status of the anomaly and of the recent results that we're going to try and interpret. And then we'll ask 3 questions. What happens if we take into account MiniBooNE systematics in the latest MicroBooNE results? What are the limits on stereoneutrinos in an oscillation type of model? And finally, we'll ask the question if we've tested all of the explanations of the MiniBooNE anomaly so far. So for those that are not familiar with neutrino experiments, I'll just give you a 2-minute brief introduction to it. The general idea is that you have protons on target that produce a lot of mesons. Through magnetic fields in these horn setups, you focus these mesons in the direction that you want your beam to be in. And you can see there on the left an example of the mesons of the neutrinos from mesons separated into pi plus and kaons. And you see that before the magnetic field and after the magnetic field. So you try to enhance this flux by pointing in the right direction. And that's what you get at the bottom. That's the flux as a function of the neutrino energy. And you can see, which is going to be important for this talk, that most of the flux is in muon neutrinos and anti-muon neutrinos, while there's a subdominant component of order 10⁻³ of the main flux of electron neutrinos. The goal is then to measure these neutrinos interacting at a near site. This is what we're going to be interested in. And at the energies relevant for MiniBooNE, this experiment, we'll be talking about sub GeV to up to 1,2 GeV in energy. At those energies, neutrino interacts with nuclei in 3 main ways. The first one is charge current quasi-elastic. So that's producing a charged lepton, which identifies the flavor of the neutrino and kicks out a proton in this case. And then you can excite this nucleon to a certain resonance, which then de-excites back to the nucleon plus a pion or something else. And finally, you can undergo DIS scattering at much higher Q². But that's a very small fraction of the total cross-section. Here you see in the MicroBooNE and MiniBooNE energy range where you are in terms of these cross-sections. Most of your events are quasi-elastic, but there is still some significant chunk of resonant events and a very small amount of DIS. Now, to make things more difficult, this is all taking place inside of a nucleus. So whenever you scatter, so to say, the hard scattering process on the proton, for example, that will be located inside of a nuclear medium. And therefore, the final state that you see in the detector may not necessarily be the same final state that you have in the underlying process. Because inside of that nuclear medium, the proton may charge exchange, it may kick out additional pions and so on. So that's one complication to keep in mind. For us in this talk, we'll be talking about short baseline oscillations. And that will mean an oscillation that develops at an L over E of order 100 meters per 100 MeV. And if there is such an oscillation, this would come due to a delta M squared of order 1 EV squared. So this type of delta M squared is much larger than the delta M squareds that we already know of between the first and second and first and third neutrinos. Those are of order 10 to minus 3 and 10 to minus 5 EV. But this is much larger. So that's a new type of oscillation that we are looking for. Because it's a much larger delta M squared, the oscillation develops much faster than any of the other ones. So while you expect standard oscillations to take place between the near and the far side, at the near side, which is the closest to the target, you only expect these short baseline ones. All the other ones haven't developed yet. So as a consequence, that makes your life easier because this is a 2 neutrino problem effectively. So all of your oscillation probabilities will be valid in a 2 neutrino approximation. This is what they look like. And I want to draw your attention to two things. First is that there is one frequency of oscillation, that's the delta M squared of order 1 EV squared. And then there are two angles, two mixing elements. One appears in muon disappearance, so the amount of mu-mu's that stay in the beam and don't oscillate to an invisible neutrino. One that enters in electron disappearance. And finally, the product of those two mixing elements appears in the appearance probability, which is the transition of one flavor into another. What that means for us is that if you see appearance signals, you should also see disappearance signals accompanied by that. And in fact, if you see disappearance signals, that goes like the 4th power of these small mixing elements, while the disappearance signals goes like 1 minus the square of this quantity. Okay, so the short baseline puzzle. And before talking about MiniBooNE, I have to talk about LSND. This is the first anomaly that was observed and that motivated the existence of MiniBooNE. And LSND works in a little bit of a different way. The beam is a pion decay at rest source. So it's not a beam, actually it's just a pion decay at rest source where after decay to a muon, which subsequently also decays at rest, gives you a nu mu bar flux component. That nu mu bar, if you have oscillations, can oscillate into nu e bars. And if you have nu e bars inside of the LSND detector, these nu e bars will go inverse beta decay processes, which produce positrons that would appear as a prompt signal, followed by the production of a neutron that scatters around for a little bit and eventually gets absorbed. The beautiful thing about this process is that it's a very clean signature to look for. You get a prompt signal followed by a delayed neutron capture. So it's very low background. Using that technique, LSND observed an excess of nu e bars in the beam. You can see the data on top of the background prediction there. And clearly there's an excess. And if you quantify the significance, that's of order 3.8 sigma. Around the same time and contemporary to LSND, there was another experiment called Carmen. It was a very similar setup. I show you the main differences in red at the top. But the overall conclusion is that Carmen did not have as much statistics as much exposure. So it could not exclude the oscillations seen by LSND. A couple of curious facts are that LSND is more or less along the proton beam. There's a 12-degree angle, while Carmen is completely 90 degrees with respect to the proton beam. That's one thing to keep in mind. So clearly more data was needed. Yeah. Yes, so actually LSND is the only one that has a decaying flat flux. So there's a subcomponent of this experiment that doesn't come from pion decay at rest. It comes from the pions and muons that actually do not decay at rest. It's a small one, but it will be there for LSND. It will be much smaller for Carmen. Okay, so more data was needed, and that's where MiniBooNE came in. MiniBooNE is an accelerator experiment. As I said before, it's a 1 GeV, basically neutrino energy. And it detected neutrinos through all of those processes we discussed before, but the way it sees the final state electron is indistinguishable from the way you would see a final state photon. So any electromagnetic final state, whether it's an electron photon or a plus and minus pairs that are overlapping, would appear as a single Cherenkov ring inside of the detector. That is to be contrasted with muons that look like sharper, more well-defined rings in the detector. This is what they observed first at the top in the nu-mu sample. So the beam is mostly nu-mus. So you measure mostly muons being produced inside of the experiment. And that's what they see. You can see the prediction as a dashed line and in orange on top of the data in black at the top. And that sets your overall normalization of how many neutrinos you have in your detector. Most of these will be nu-mus. So that's your normalization measurement. And then you ask, out of those, how many have transversed to mu-es, coming from example from an oscillation signature. And that's what you see at the bottom, where you have the data in black and the background in green and orange. So you can ignore the blue region for a second. So that's clearly an excess of events, especially peaking at the lowest energies, and a significance of almost 5 sigma. So this is hugely significant, but the main limitation of the MiniBooNE excess is not the statistics, but rather the systematical uncertainty here. So if we were only to talk about statistics, the MiniBooNE excess would have been above 5 sigma a long time ago. So the crucial part of the MiniBooNE excess is understanding that background. That's where the systematics is coming from. If we believe these are oscillations, then the best fit in parameter space, which is given by the mass square difference, so that approximately 1 EV region that you care about, versus that appearance angle, which is the product of these two matrix elements there. You see the region of preference for MiniBooNE in solid curves, overlapped with the regions of preference for LSND as the colored regions. So naively, if you look at this plot, you'd be tempted to conclude that MiniBooNE and LSND point to the same oscillation parameters and that we have discovered a sterile neutrino. Of course, the situation is a little bit more difficult. First of all, what you see in this plot is a relative statement only. So the regions of confidence here are drawn as confidence intervals, and they're relative statements. They tell you what is the best fit in this parameter space given your data, but they don't tell you how good of a fit to the data your model actually is. So for that, we can look at the chi-square per degrees of freedom or the p-value, and that gives you of order 10% for the best fit point in oscillations. If you were to have a 85% exclusion, that would be excluding the best fit model in oscillations. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that definitely background only hypothesis excluded, so something is going on, but oscillations do not perfectly explain your data as well. So that's the conclusion here. And then you can ask yourself questions about the backgrounds. Several of these backgrounds are data-driven estimates. So you can measure them with some sideband sample and extrapolate them to the signal region. One good example is the pi0 background. So these are two separate photons coming from pi0 decay that usually and most often you would measure with separated photons inside of your detector. But if they were to mimic the signal, they would have to be overlapping photons in a given direction, mimicking a single electron-like final state. So by measuring the separated photons and knowing about the kinematics of pi0 decay, you get to extrapolate that thing to the region where you would contribute to the signal. That same measurement also constrains what's called delta radiative decay. So the delta is an excited state of the nucleon. Once you produce the delta, typically it will decay back to pi zeros and nucleons. By measuring that pi0 rate, you measure the total delta production rate. And if you know the branch ratio of delta to single photons, which is what's contributing in light brown here, we'd also have a constraint on that quantity, on that background. There are other sources here. Most of them are constrained by other data sets inside of the same experiment, and sometimes by a previous near detector site that used to be part of MiniBooNE. But there are other two interesting features of the excess. The first one is that as you decrease the volume of the MiniBooNE tank of your detector, the significance of the total excess increases. So that's telling you that this is unlikely to be coming from external sources linking in. Second is that the excess overlaps in time with the neutrino beam. So that's also telling you that probably not coming from other sources of, let's say, things produced outside of the dirt that leak inside of the detector, because those would be delayed with respect to the main neutrinos in the beam. Okay, so several people have studied these backgrounds. The latest paper on this by phenomenologists here at the bottom asks the following question. Okay, so we know that probably none of each of these individual backgrounds can explain the full excess. But what if every single one of them conspires in just the right way to fill that gap? So that's called the Altarelli cocktail. And the conclusion of the paper is that the most uncertain quantity in this problem is the branch ratio of the delta into a single photon. And that even by varying several different backgrounds, as well as this radiative branching ratio, you can reduce the significance of the excess, not surprisingly, but not fully do away with it. Okay, so are we ready to claim discovery? Situation is more complicated than that. The primary reason, and as I told you before, is that we see appearance signals, so new mu's going to new e's, but we don't see disappearance signals, or at least not convincing disappearance signals. We have here in the middle the new mu disappearance picture. So these are limits set by other experiments looking for the disappearance of new mu's. And you can see the regions of preference for the MiniBooNE anomaly here in red are fully covered by all of these different curves coming from several different experimental searches. So that's in the new mu sector. So we can also go to the new E sector and ask, do we see any new E disappearance? And in that case, the situation is much more complicated because, yes, there are hints of anomalies, there are excesses seen, but not all experiments agree on what these excesses are, and not all experiments are allowed by other new disappearance data. So these authors here have done a recent study of the global new E disappearance picture, and you see, depending on what data sets you include, you get a different answer. So the situation in the new E sector is inconclusive, but we don't see new mu disappearance so far. Any questions at this point? If not, then I'll just conclude this introductory part saying, clearly there's been huge progress. MiniBooNE and LSND are the most sensitive appearance experiments to date, but there's still no coherent picture. So every time you try to nail down this stereo neutrino, it just escapes you. Okay, so we need to zoom in on the excess and try to ask better questions. We know that we see these Cherenkov rings as an excess in MiniBooNE. What are they made of? Well, they could be made of photons or electrons or E plus and minuses. And that's where you need a better detector to look for the actual origin of these events. This is where MicroBooNE comes in. So they have this advantage in liquid argon that lets you distinguish electrons from photons. The way you would do this is to explore two interesting properties of photons, which are that at production, if I know where my neutrino interacted, these photons travel a given distance inside of my detector before converting to an E plus E minus pair that you actually measure. So this separation gap does not happen for electrons because they get produced and start leaving charge deposition in your liquid argon TPC right away. And the second property is that the beginning of this shower from a photon has two electrons, or an E plus E minus pair, while the electron only has a single particle. So the energy deposition as a function of distance in the beginning of this shower is compatible with a single minimally ionizing particle in the case of electrons, and compatible with two minimally ionizing particles in the case of the photon. So that's one way that you can distinguish between the two final states. There you can see some nice pretty pictures of what these events look like in liquid argon. So you see the one photon, one proton sample, that's one gamma, one P. That's the proton at the vertex, a separation gap, and the shower coming from the photon. And here at the bottom, you see the one electron, one P, with no separation gap and the electron shower. Okay, so the first MicroBooNE result was concerned with the single photon hypothesis. So what if the MiniBooNE excess was coming from an poorly understood delta background, giving you more photons? That's the process that we're interested in. So there's some resonance, and that produces, oh, that diagram is not conserving charge. That should be a proton on both ends of the diagram, excuse me. So that's producing a single photon, and there is a very tailored search for this final state inside of MicroBooNE. That's the result that you see there on the left. So I wanted to pay attention first to the constrained part. So this is after they've modeled the background and constrained it with sideband data. And you see the data point, which is the total rate of single photons accompanied by a proton inside of the detector, is compatible with the background prediction, which is this band with the hashed region that you see there, with a little bit of an under fluctuation in the data. If MiniBooNE was to be fully explained by this single background, you'd expect to be in the dashed yellow point. So you're clearly below it, and you can set a constraint on the rate of this process. At the bottom, you can see as a function of the invariant mass of the proton and the photon, what your prediction would be. So here's your total effective branching ratio of delta to a single proton gamma. So that's what the standard model predicts in green. In orange is what you would need to explain the full excess. And in red, you see the limits coming from MicroBooNE. So it disfavors this type of explanation, this mismodeling of the background. Of course, it does not measure that background. So it does not get to the point where you expect to see the prediction from the standard model, but it does set a constraint. Other final state photons are not excluded. So you could have a source of coherent photons, things that come without the associated proton. That's still not excluded by the MicroBooNE search. And you could have other new particles that get produced elsewhere and decay into single photons, or get produced inside of the detector that decay into single photons. They're not coming from delta, and those will not be excluded either, because this search is so tailored for this final state. Okay, so now we'll get to the electron neutrino search. So this is the one that you would care about if you were looking for oscillations. This is a search that matters for new mu's that go into new e's, give you an excess of new e events inside of the detector. So MicroBooNE did not look for oscillations as opposed to MiniBooNE and LSND. What it looked for was this electron low energy excess signal model, which I'll call the low energy template, the electron low energy excess template. So what does it exactly mean? The template is central value of MiniBooNE data minus background. So on the left there, you have the MiniBooNE data as a function of reconstructed neutrino energy. In green, you have the intrinsic nu E background. So this is coming from the nu E contamination in the beam. And in purple, you have the exact central value of data minus central value of background discrepancy. That's the MiniBooNE excess, and that's what we'll call the LEE template. So what MicroBooNE did is they unfolded that data minus background difference into a prediction for an excess of nu E in the beam. So on the right, that's as a function of true neutrino energy, the total number of you can think of it as an additional flux of electron neutrinos in the beam. To do that, you have to unfold the detector resolution, smearing, and in doing so, you lose some information. So you know how to go from a true neutrino flux prediction to an observed event rate, but in doing the opposite, you know that you lose some information. But that's just a part of the unfolding procedure. And now that they have this prediction from unfolding to the true neutrino energy spectrum, they can then apply that spectrum to the MicroBooNE experiment, given a set of analysis and selection cuts and etc., and that will give them an event rate prediction. So a given template in MiniBooNE gets unfolded into a true quantity, which then gets you a prediction at MicroBooNE. Now, of course, you can use this prediction in several different analyses, and that's what they've done. So given a true spectrum, you can do several selection cuts and reconstruction algorithms for that true spectrum. So that's what they're looking for, central value of data minus central value of background. This uncertainty that you see around the black dots in the true spectrum is for internal consistency and will not play a role in the rest of this talk, which, as we'll see, will be important. So there are 3 separate analyses in MicroBooNE. The first one is using only events that look like CCQE. And here you have to remember that looks like CCQE may not necessarily be CCQE events because of nuclear effects, but they're looking for 1 electron, 1 proton final state. The other one is a pionless final state. So it's 1 electron plus whatever else except pions. And the final one is inclusive, meaning I see 1 electron, I know that's a nu E interacting, and I don't care what happened in the nuclear leg of the process. Whatever else I see in my detector. These are the event rates observed and the background prediction for each one of these analyses. So we can start with one on the left. So the background prediction are the solid histograms here. The prediction in the case of the template model being correct, so data minus background in MiniBooNE, is the dashed red. That's what you would expect if MiniBooNE saw exactly that excess of nu E's in the beam. And the data is, of course, as the black points, and you see that definitely does not agree with the template prediction. So you can set a constraint. In fact, I will point out that exactly at the point where the template prediction peaks, you have another fluctuation of your data. So your constraint will be, you expect it to be stronger than your sensitivity. And then in the middle, you have the pionless final states with or without protons. With protons, you see you also have a little bit of a deficit where the template prediction is in dashed red and everything else is backgrounds. And I'll say all of this green region here is intrinsic nu E's. So these are genuine nu E's in the beam that are contaminating your sample or not coming from other new physics processes. And here, most of the background is coming from pi zeros, which are photon-like. But for some reason, because the reconstruction is not perfect, turn out to appear like electrons. That's the only sample that sees a little bit of an excess that you see here, but it's also the less sensitive one. You can see the difference between the prediction of the template and the background is very small. So this is the least sensitive sample, and it's the only one that sees an excess. And finally, the one with most statistics, not surprisingly, you're counting everything, is the inclusive one, where you also see a little bit of a deficit at the point where you have the template prediction. So all of these analyses are then used to constrain the template model, where in this plot here, I'm showing you events observed over the prediction with no template. So if if there was no physics and no template, no new physics and no template, you'd expect to be at 1. That's certainly your background uncertainty that you see there. And if template describes correctly your new physics, then you expect to be in the red points. So for all 3 most pure samples, you see another fluctuation, except in the one where your background is coming mostly from pi zeros. And that sets constraints in each one of these analyses. So this is the technical conclusion of all of these analyses in MicroBooNE. So they reject the hypothesis that new charge current interactions are fully responsible for the excess at a given confidence level, 95%, 97%, for all of these final states. Now, this is a statement about new charge current cross sections coming from that template model, which is central value of data minus central value of background. Of course, the headlines are a little bit more grandiose. So you see things like neutrinos, stereo neutrinos are dead, and comments like that. But there are, of course, still questions that remain to be answered in this picture. We haven't seen an excess of new E, so of course we haven't confirmed new physics. But the harder question is, should we have seen new physics? And does the data that we have allow you to rule out the hypothesis that MiniBooNE has seen new physics? So we'll go through each one of these questions now. The first one is, how about MiniBooNE systematics? So the template choice was central value of data minus central value of background, which is shown here in gray as a function of the neutrino energy. But I can also deviate from this template and ask the question, how good is my new template? How great, in how much agreement is that new template with the MiniBooNE data, even MiniBooNE systematics? And then I can come up with other templates. Let's call it, for example, the even lower energy excess template that has a p-value of 10%, which is the same type of p-value that you see in the best fit of oscillations. So if I take that template, I have a completely different shape to my data minus background. If I take the flat energy excess, which is a completely different template, so more or less flat in energy, I can also achieve a 10% p-value agreement with the data. And now, of course, what we did is we take all of these different templates, new hypothesis for MiniBooNE, given a given p-value, and we unfold by reproducing MicroBooNE's unfolding technique into a prediction for MicroBooNE. So you see here template 2, which is a little bit of a deviation from the nominal one, gives you a very different prediction from the nominal at MicroBooNE. You see a much higher energy tail here, much longer high energy tail. And then I can also pick one with slightly less events at the low energy and have less events here. Okay, so this procedure is clear. All we are doing is reproducing MicroBooNE's analysis for different choices of an initial template. Now, what I can do is generalize this approach. So I take some class of MiniBooNE backgrounds. I vary them by a little bit. I compute the p-value for this new template that I've obtained by varying the backgrounds. I unfold that template into a prediction for true spectrum and then make a prediction for MicroBooNE, given that true spectrum, and compute the chi-squared for the MicroBooNE data minus background for MicroBooNE prediction. If I do that for several values and choices of MiniBooNE backgrounds, I can then take each template, plot the signal strength, which is the number of events over the nominal number of events of the template for my new template. So if I have more events in my new template compared with the nominal, I'll be above 1. If I have less events in my template with respect to the nominal, I'll be below 1. And in colors, you see every point here corresponds to a different template, and they're colored according to their p-value in MiniBooNE. What that means is that if you are in the pinkish or the lightest region here, you have an agreement with MiniBooNE data above 80%, which is great agreement. If I'm at the lighter blue region, then I have a slightly worse agreement, but greater than 10% p-value. And on the y-axis, you see the delta chi-squared for MicroBooNE. So the nominal choice by MicroBooNE is here in star as a star. That gives you the constraint that we saw before, a 97% confidence level limit. But if I modify the template in MiniBooNE by a little bit, even within 80%, I can go all the way down here to this first benchmark point here for this given choice of template. And that has a much lower delta chi-squared than MicroBooNE. Therefore, you expect a much less stringent constraint on that template.
Right. I think I missed, like, what are your boundaries in terms of like modifying your templates? You're just doing it because like you can, or like what are like?
Yeah. So the point is I don't have a specific model, so I'm trying to be kind of as model agnostic as I can in the same spirit of the MicroBooNE analysis.
You know, an way to say this is like you're just like adding noise to the background.
Exactly.
Some systematic to the background.
Exactly.
And it's just like, sure. Okay.
So I know how to go from a background prediction to a given MiniBooNE p-value. And I do that for several slight variations of that background prediction.
But experimentals will tell you, we measure this and we understand this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you know, when you say that they can say, so you're basically telling them that they don't understand the systematics in the background.
I'm telling them that they need to take the systematics of the MiniBooNE background into account when computing the MicroBooNE delta chi-squared in their analysis. Okay. I haven't modified the systematics. What I've modified is the value of the template.
Okay.
So the crucial point here is that they've taken central value of data minus central value of the background. What we are saying is we're taking central value of data minus a given position in their background distribution, right? If that position is too far away from the central prediction of your background, then you should be penalized in the computation of the p-value in MiniBooNE because that's far away from your best background fit. And that will reflect on your p-value in this plot. So we haven't modified the systematics, but we've modified the choice of the template within the allowed systematics, within the allowed regions of the systematics of MiniBooNE.
Okay, I think you got it.
Yeah. So the p-value here dictates how well you have an agreement with MiniBooNE data. And it's just a different choice for data minus a given value of the background. Of course, you can argue that the way we've done this changes the density of points in this plot. So I varied the total normalization of each of 4 different classes of backgrounds. If I had done that by very individual bins instead, I could have obtained a different distribution of points, but with enough statistics, you should fill all of these regions. Okay, so the conclusion here is that they're perfectly allowed templates in MiniBooNE, given the MiniBooNE systematics, which have much less, which are much less strictly limited by MicroBooNE data. Okay, any more questions on the templates? And if not, then we can ask a similar question to what we've been asking so far, but with a physical model. So instead of talking about templates, I can talk about a model prediction in terms of physical parameters. One way to do that is using an oscillation. That's the way that the other short baseline experiments will do this. So what we've done is we've set constraints on an oscillation parameter oscillation model for inclusive and CCQE data sets of MicroBooNE. They have advantages and disadvantages. In the inclusive one, you have more statistics, but your backgrounds are higher. And in the CCQE, your backgrounds are smaller, but your statistics is also smaller. So it's a non-trivial interplay here. But by doing this, predicting event spectra in MiniBooNE in a given model, and then asking the question, what is the agreement with MicroBooNE data? We're able to set limits in the parameter space of the oscillation. And you see here, again, as a function of the appearance angle and delta m squared, the regions of preference for MiniBooNE as this hashed gray regions. And the constraints from MicroBooNE at 3 sigma for the inclusive case in blue, and then for CCQE case in orange. So the conclusion here is that in the simplest oscillation model, if I take the inclusive sample, which is the more sensitive one, that excludes most, but not all of the 1 sigma region of MiniBooNE. So there is still parameter space left. It does not actually fully cover the MiniBooNE regions of preference. And then you can ask the question, of course, we know you've seen a deficit, so how does that compare to the constraint that you expected to set if your agreement with the background was exact? That's your Asimov limit. So if I artificially set the data to agree with the background, that's your sensitivity to the new physics. And that's what you had in these dashed lines here. And because of the deficit of events, you get to set a slightly stronger constraint in solid. So that's just coming from the underfluctuation of the data. There's one more thing, and this is a rather important point that I wanted to make, is in this analysis that I had just shown you, the only thing we've done is we set a constraint using appearance from an oscillation model. So the only thing we've modified in our prediction is how many new mu's have transversed into new e's. But in a full consistent oscillation picture, you should have appearance as well as disappearance. So all of these other sideband data and other measurements that MicroBooNE does in order to derive their main signal for the appearance signal, they also have to be oscillated in a way. So the oscillation may impact your sideband samples. So for example, the overall normalization that is set by the new mu charge current measurement, that can get modified by new mu disappearance. If a lot of your new mu's are disappearing, you would artificially change your normalization of your flux and absorb that effect, thinking that it does not come from new physics. So we do that for the inclusive analysis for all of these other sidebands that you're seeing here, which then get fed into a background prediction for the main event spectrum that you see in the middle, which is the same one that you see, sorry, here. So that's your final prediction, and that's containing all of the constraints from the sideband data that you see in this plot. So by doing that, not only do we have to do that for MicroBooNE, but also for MiniBooNE using this fully consistent picture. And for MiniBooNE, you get a different region of preference, shown here also as a function of the appearance angle and delta m squared. But now I'm marginalizing or allowing for all possible values of amounts of disappearance in the new mu and new e samples. So your regions of preference look very different now. You see these gray regions for MiniBooNE. They go all the way down to 0 because now I've opened up the possibility to explain the MiniBooNE excess by changing the new mu normalization, which changes your background prediction in the new e sample to agree with the data. But there are, of course, other solutions that contain appearance, and these are the ones that we're mostly interested in. And then the new sets of constraints coming from, the new constraint coming from inclusive sample, here's a solid blue. And you can see that at the 3 sigma level, coming from the 3 sigma constraint from MicroBooNE does not even cover the one sigma region in MiniBooNE. So from that, you can conclude that in this fully consistent picture, MicroBooNE does not exclude oscillations as an explanation to the MiniBooNE excess. Here on the right, you have other plots showing what the situation looks like in the new mu disappearance part of your model, which is dictated by this muon mixing angle, and the electron disappearance part of your model in the electron mixing angle. Any questions? If not, then I'll cover just a couple of other papers that appeared around the same time that seem to point to the same direction, but just want to clarify a couple of points. The first one is this joint fit produced by the MiniBooNE collaboration using MicroBooNE data and MiniBooNE data. To do this full analysis properly, what you would like is a joint fit using MiniBooNE and MicroBooNE data, using correlations between these two samples, which are coming from the fact that MiniBooNE and MicroBooNE are in the same beam and they see similar cross sections. They're on different nuclear targets, but the underlying rates will be correlated. What you see here on the right is MiniBooNE's attempt at such joint fit. Unfortunately, no correlations were taken into account. And unfortunately, all they use is the CCQE sample, which, as we saw before, is the less sensitive one. And unsurprisingly, the best fit before including MicroBooNE data looks very similar to the best fit including MicroBooNE data. Namely, the conclusion is MicroBooNE data does not exclude the oscillation explanation of MiniBooNE. But this part here, the fact that no correlations were taken into account, is a very important one. And it's something to keep an eye on for the future. The other point was made by a paper that appeared slightly before ours, claiming that we have this sample with lots of different deficits in the data compared with backgrounds. And now the backgrounds in MicroBooNE are coming mostly from genuine NUEs in the beam from the contamination. So perhaps you have NUE disappearance, and that's what explains this deficit. So if I forget about what's happening with new mu's and turn off the appearance channels, so I only focus on disappearance of the NUEs, I can fit for that disappearance in parameter space, where this angle, you can think of it essentially as UE4, the mixing angle of the fourth neutrino with the electron flavor. And that's what the author obtains as a function of m squared and that electron mixing angle. And you see that it matches more or less with other anomalies that we'll not really go into here. But when we reproduce that exercise, we do not find such region of preference. With our full picture, including slightly more sophisticated way of computing the event predictions for MicroBooNE, we find a best fit point in parameter space. So this is the best fit in an oscillation model that has non-zero electron disappearance mixing angle, but it has zero muon disappearance. So you're saying you would like to have no new mu's disappearance, but a slight amount of NUE disappearance, but that is at a significance below 1 sigma. So therefore we think not worth mentioning. Okay, and now for the final part of the talk, unless there are questions on the oscillation picture.
Why do you get that?
Just because the significance of this best fit with electron disappearance is too small. What you're seeing there, for example, is our curve in the electron disappearance mixing angle. And at the confidence level of 95%, there is no closed contour. I believe this is a 95% confidence level region here. It might be 1 and 2 sigma, I have to check. But clearly, at the 2 sigma and 95% confidence level, we see no closed contours. The main difference here is coming from the fact that we have oscillations in the sideband samples, which change the normalization of your background if you had NUE disappearance. So when doing this thing fully consistent in a full oscillation model, you'd get our answer. Okay, now we're not done yet with MiniBooNE. I don't want you to go through every single one of these predictions, but this is a table of most explanations put so far in the literature to the MiniBooNE excess. Starting at the very top, we have oscillations, and then things that look like oscillations but aren't quite that. So that's what we call flavor transitions. And they all may have good or bad explanations of different aspects of the MiniBooNE excess. But the point is that there are lots of other models with completely different mechanisms to explain the anomaly that have nothing to do with oscillations. And those we haven't tested yet. And that includes, by the way, some proposals by colleagues here in the audience at the very bottom. So there is still a long list of stuff to test. Most things that have to do with electron neutrinos in the beam, in a sense, have been tested by MicroBooNE. You'd like to have a full analysis dedicated for a given model, but we have seen the data for electron neutrinos already. One class of these models are coming from upscattering of neutrinos in the beam to things that decay into E+ and minus. One such example of that would be a model with heavy neutrinos that also couple to dark photons. So through a combination of neutrino mixing and kinetic mixing between the standard model photon and the dark photon, you upscatter to this heavy state. And because of this new force, this heavy state, this N, is short-lived and decays inside of your detector into an overlapping plus and minus pair. There are several other variants of this model. You could use scalars to upscatter into this heavy neutrino, which gives you a better angle distribution. You could think of other 2 to 3 processes, but the idea that you're using E+ and minuses as a final state is more or less the same, and that remains untested. And for that, we have upcoming work where we write a specific Monte Carlo generator for each one of these processes. And this is a non-trivial task because what you're doing is you're using neutrino nucleus upscattering to some new state. And that's hard to model with other existing tools in the field. So that's where this dark news Monte Carlo generator will come in. And these are just some teasers for what's to come. So with this tool, you could fit the MiniBooNE excess in parameter space here as a function of the mass of the heavy neutrino and the mass of the dark photon on the x-axis, where below the diagonal, you have off-shell dark photons, which make your heavy neutrinos a little too long-lived, so you cannot explain the excess, but above the diagonal, the dark photon gets produced on shell, and there you have a chance to explain the energy spectrum of the excess. You can also have multiple heavy neutrinos, and that's what the code will do for you, where you get to use the point where dark photons are off shell, where now the price that you pay in the decay process does not include a small mixing angle between the heavy neutrinos and the light neutrinos. So that's also possible. All of these things will, of course, be testable at MicroBooNE, where now you'd like to look for E+ and minus final states rather than photons or electrons. And that's just for illustration, what this thing would look like. You could have a proton vertex where you find the position of the neutrino interaction, and then you look for an E+ and minus pair displaced from that. If they're overlapping, this thing will look like a single photon shower, but you can also look for final states that have non-overlapping events. And with that, that brings me to my conclusions. So the 3 questions that we asked: how about MiniBooNE systematics in the context of the MicroBooNE results? Well, this can have the potential to significantly change the conclusions of the MicroBooNE study. So this is something to keep an eye on. We have not included the correlations between the 2 experiments, and that's something that only the collaboration can realistically do. So another thing to keep an eye on. And the limits on stereo neutrinos do not fully exclude the oscillation explanation. And I'll start by saying that the oscillation does not provide a perfect explanation. We saw the p-value of 10%, but it would be incorrect to say that MicroBooNE excludes stereo neutrinos as an explanation of MiniBooNE. Finally, have we tested our models? No, there are other long list of other explanations, and people keep proposing more and more by the day. So something to look forward to in the future. With that, thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Time to ask questions for Matheus.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the Cherenkov signature of electrons and E+, E-. Is it possible to disentangle E+, E- with some, I don't know, some sort of like, I don't know what sort of resolution you have, but some like machine learning deep neural network or some sort of. So
the way they do this in MiniBooNE is they have 2 hypotheses for fuzzy rings. They fit that fuzzy ring to a single electron hypothesis and get a given likelihood. and then they fit that again to a 2-shower hypothesis. And all you can really say here is whether it's 1 or 2 showers. And that underlying shower can be electron or a photon, but that's the distinguishing feature here. And then they will place a cut on that ratio between how likely it is to be a single shower over how likely it is to be 2 showers. So it's not a discrete thing that you can do, but essentially what they're doing is what you're describing. There's a fitting method for one and the other. And to obtain a result, you have to make a decision at some point as a cut. It's something that you would do in machine learning. You obtain a score and then you have to cut that score at some point. So in a sense, they already do that. The thing that I will say is all of the excess looks like it's a single thing, and that's what you're looking for. And more or less the resolution, it's hard to say because this is a continuous curve, of course, but of order 10 to 15%, 10 to 15 degrees of opening angle between the 2 objects. But that's actually a very good question. If you have a model with E plus E minuses, how would you, what is the efficiency that you reconstruct that E plus E minus as a single shower as a function of that opening angle? I don't think anyone has the answer to that question. Most Pheno studies, including ours, all they do is say there is a given angle that below which I'll consider it as a single shower. That's around 10 to 15 degrees.
Other questions?
People on Zoom can write in the chat and I will see if they have questions.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So what's the future? Like, for example, with MicroBooNE data set or any of the future.
Right. So, yeah, this is not.
This question. Can you repeat this question?
Oh, yeah. The question is, what is the future and how we can test this at other neutrino facilities?
The sterile solution.
The sterile solution. So for the sterile solution in particular, what you can make use of is the future, and one of which is actually currently operating, detectors that will be in the same beam. So MicroBooNE was in the same beam as MiniBooNE, a slightly different location, but there will be additional detectors, one at a much closer position to the source and one which is further. Now you have this triangulation of positions, and if you have an oscillation, you would see one part of the oscillation at the near site, another part in the intermediate site in MicroBooNE, and a final one in the far detector. So that is much more sensitive to oscillation features than just a single MicroBooNE detector. And the near site, being so near to the source, will also collect a lot more statistics than MicroBooNE. So that full interplay between the 3 detectors will cover, according to their latest sensitivity curves, the full region of interest. What becomes hard is when you don't have oscillations. So a very large delta M squared, this thing doesn't oscillate. It just produces a deficit of new mu's and a zero distance effect, basically. So all 3 detectors would see the same signature, and therefore you don't have this L over E dependence that you can triangulate. That may be harder, but with more statistics and clever techniques, maybe they can also tackle this large delta M squared region. I should say for other models that have to do with scattering. So in that list that I showed you, a lot of them have to do with neutrinos producing new stuff in the detector. That is not dependent on your distance between your source and the detectors, just dependent on how many targets you have. So going at a near site where your rates go up due to the large flux, that will also help with those predictions, with those models. So testing some of the scattering physics at a near site would be much more interesting.
Are there other questions? I actually have a question. So related to the question about the angular resolution of the MiniBooNE. So do you remember the angular resolution of the MicroBooNE detector? I mean, I'm pretty sure the liquid argon detector is better the resolution, and it's easier to nail down this possibility.
Yeah. So for final states like these, no one really knows what that resolution currently is. And that's something that we're working on with people in Colombia, in New York. So all I can say at this point is that you can do this technique of looking for E plus and minuses, even if they don't look completely separated. So there is still an advantage of having a genuine E plus and minus over a single photon. There's still something you can do to separate the two. And most of these models will predict things that will look like single photons rather than separated E plus and minuses. The population of single photons, given the current reconstruction techniques, are likely to be much larger than the population of separated final states for most of these explanations. But that's under study. So yeah, it's.
Any further questions for him? Okay, let's then Matheus again.
Thank you.